The air inside the Supreme Court was so still it felt alive. The walls seemed to lean closer as if even marble wanted to listen. Every seat was taken. Reporters pressed against wooden railings, senators leaning forward. Aides frozen mid-note. All eyes fixed on one figure at the center, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, standing calm beneath the nation's highest seal. Her voice had that quiet strength that doesn't beg for attention. It commands it. The debate had been fierce, her opponent relentless, but now it was her turn to close. She inhaled, the silence thick enough to weigh on her chest, then spoke her final line, measured, deliberate, devastating. For some, she said, her gaze sweeping across the chamber, the law is a shield for power. For others, it's the last line of defense for the powerless. I stand with the latter and I won't apologize for it. The words hung there, suspended. You could hear the faint hum of the air vents, the rustle of someone shifting in disbelief. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, from the bench where tradition forbids reaction, a sound broke the spell. Clap one. Then another. It was Justice John Roberts, the chief himself, slowly rising to his feet, his expression unreadable, but the message unmistakable. Respect. Gasps cut through the room like camera shutters. Reporters forgot their notes. A senator's mouth fell open. Somewhere in the gallery, someone whispered, "Did that just happen?" The applause wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Its echo carried something deeper than volume, a shift. The kind of moment that tells you the narrative just changed, that intellect had forced even power to pause. Crockett didn't smile. She simply lowered her head slightly, as if acknowledging something larger than herself, the principle she had invoked, the truth she had defended. Every soul in that chamber knew they had just witnessed a fracture in the usual order of things. The old guard silenced not by outrage, but by reason, and as the cameras zoomed in, capturing the stunned faces, one question began to ripple through every newsroom and living room in America. What did she say that made the Chief Justice himself applaud? But to understand why the Chief Justice stood in respect, we need to rewind just 48 hours. 48 hours earlier, Washington was a storm without thunder, just endless noise. The headlines were ruthless, the kind that feed on division. Every network framed the upcoming Supreme Court hearing as a reckoning, a showdown, a trial of optics. They weren't wrong. It wasn't just about legal arguments anymore. It was about who could dominate the narrative. For days, Jasmine Crockett's name had been trending for all the wrong reasons. Or perhaps the most calculated ones. Political commentators dissected her every expression. Clips of her past committee hearings resurfaced, cut and spliced to paint her as fiery, unpredictable. Too emotional. Conservative pundits mocked her tone. Liberal ones pleaded with her to stay calm. Every frame was crafted to contain her before she even entered the room. And yet, she walked toward that chamber knowing exactly what was waiting. The press had already decided the story. All she could do now was rewrite it in real time. The steps leading up to the courthouse felt heavier that morning. Protesters lined the edges of the marble plaza, waving signs that blurred into color, some cheering her on, others shouting words designed to sting. Cameras tracked her every move like hawks. Behind her, aides whispered about optics. Ahead of her, history whispered about courage. Inside, the stakes were more than political. The issue at hand, an inquiry into executive overreach, was a battle over the soul of American governance. But beneath that, something more human was unfolding, a clash between truth-seeking and image management, between those who practiced law as performance and those who believed in its sacred duty to protect the vulnerable. Her adversary, a senior senator known for his smug mastery of spectacle, had already begun his media tour. He'd promised to expose hypocrisy and teach a lesson in decorum. His words weren't just aimed at Crockett. They were aimed at everyone who looked like her, sounded like her, fought their way through systems not built for them. Crockett knew it. She'd seen this pattern before, how the system performs civility while silencing truth, so she planned not to play the game. Not to outshout, but to outthink. To use the very language of the law that others twisted into theater and restore it to what it once was, a measure of justice. That night before the hearing, she sat alone in her apartment. Legal notes scattered across her kitchen table, the faint glow of cable news flickering in the background. Commentators debated her strategy as if she were a chess piece, not a human being. She's overreaching. She's not ready for this level. She'll crumble under pressure. She smiled faintly at the screen. They didn't understand. Pressure wasn't her weakness. It was her element. When morning came, the Capitol air was cool, the kind that smells like rain and expectation. She dressed not for spectacle, but for purpose. Black suit, no jewelry. A quiet statement that said, "I'm not here to perform. I'm here to remind you what integrity looks like when it stops asking permission." By the time she entered the courtroom, every seat was filled, every camera light ready. The senator smirked as she took her place. The Chief Justice adjusted his glasses, expression unreadable. The tension wasn't visible. It was vibrating beneath the marble floors, an invisible current that hummed with centuries of precedent. Everyone expected another round of noise. No one expected what was coming. What happened next would redefine the tone of American justice. His name was Senator William Harland, a fixture in Washington long enough to remember when press conferences were held without microphones. To the untrained eye, he radiated statesmanship, silver hair, polished diction, and a smile rehearsed to the second. He'd built a career on the illusion of calm authority, the kind that cloaks arrogance beneath the language of civility. But to those who looked closer, the seams were showing. Harland was the kind of man who never raised his voice because he didn't have to. He raised his eyebrow instead. In hearings, he would interrupt with a drawl that sounded like charm but cut like a blade. "No, young lady," he'd often say, "let's not get emotional." It was the weapon of choice for men who mistook condescension for control. And in Washington, he had mastered the art of wielding it. Clips of his past confrontations circulated across social media like cautionary tales. There he was dismissing a climate scientist mid-sentence, smirking into the camera as the crowd murmured. Another clip showed him mocking a freshman representative for mispronouncing a procedural term, turning bureaucracy into blood sport. The right-wing networks loved it. "Old school class," one commentator called it. A master of decorum. But behind that decorum was decay. Former aides whispered about closed-door meetings where Harland bent ethics rules like wire, rationalizing every decision as the adult thing to do. Lobbyists adored him. His signature on legislation could be bought with flattery and a promise of legacy. He'd built his brand on law and order, yet quietly pushed deals that blurred both. And when cameras weren't rolling, that gentle tone of his hardened into something else. A belief that the system wasn't broken, just too crowded with newcomers trying to change it. To Harland, people like Jasmine Crockett represented the noise of a new America he didn't trust. She was young, outspoken, and unapologetically herself, a woman who carried both Southern grit and urban edge. To him, that combination wasn't power, it was threat. She mistakes passion for substance, he once told a donor at a private fundraiser. The room laughed, glasses clinked. It wasn't cruelty in their eyes, it was confidence. The smug certainty of men convinced that time itself was on their side. But beneath the applause, Harland knew something was shifting. The old tricks didn't work the way they used to. The country was changing faster than he could charm it. For the first time, he found himself challenged not by shouters or radicals, by thinkers. People like Crockett, who refused to match his arrogance with anger. She fought him with precision, not volume, and that, in his world, was the most dangerous kind of opposition. In the weeks before the hearing, Harland doubled down. His team curated talking points crafted to embarrass her, subtle jabs about professional maturity, references to decorum that carried the sting of coded insult. He was setting a trap built on expectation, that she'd react, that she'd lose composure, that the spectacle would drown out her substance. Every interview he gave dripped with performance. "I have great respect for all my colleagues," he said into a friendly camera lens, "but respect has to be earned through discipline, not theatrics." The anchor smiled, the clip went viral, and the comment sections filled with approval from those who mistook arrogance for leadership. But what the public didn't see was the tremor in his confidence. Behind the doors of his Senate office, he watched replays of Crockett's previous hearings. Her questions were sharp, surgical, impossible to dodge. He'd pause the footage mid-frame, studying her eyes, calm, unyielding. Something about that composure unnerved him. He'd faced fury before, even hatred, but this was different. This was control. In private, he muttered to an aide, "She's good. Too good." Still, he convinced himself he could win. He'd been untouchable for decades. The cameras, the public, even the judges, he'd manipulated them all before. This would be no different, he thought. Another headline, another performance. The show must go on, and so, as he entered the Supreme Court chamber that morning, every movement was deliberate. His tie a deep federal blue, his papers stacked like trophies. He greeted colleagues with that practiced half-smile. The look of a man who believes he's already written the ending. But something in the room was off. The energy didn't bend toward him like it used to. There was a hum of quiet anticipation, an undercurrent he couldn't quite read. Crockett sat across from him, posture straight, eyes clear, not performing, just present. For the first time in a long career, Harland felt something he hadn't planned for: unease. He cleared his throat, forced the smile again. The cameras turned, the hearing began, and the old guard prepared to reassert its dominance. But Crockett wasn't entering this arena unarmored. She had built her entire life preparing for moments like this, long before the cameras, before the applause, before the marble chambers and microphones. There was a young woman sitting alone in a quiet law library at 2 in the morning. Jasmine Crockett's books were spread across the table like battle plans. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, pages filled with case law and coffee stains. She wasn't there for grades or prestige. She was there because she understood, even then, that truth needed defenders. Law school wasn't kind to her. It rarely is to those who don't fit the mold. Professors interrupted her questions, classmates underestimated her, and internships favored faces with legacy surnames. Once, after she corrected a senior student's flawed citation, he laughed and said, "You're feisty. That's good for TV someday." She smiled, said nothing, and filed the moment away, not as pain but as purpose. Every night, she stayed longer than anyone else. Every morning, she arrived before dawn. She learned early that silence can be more powerful than shouting if you fill it with conviction. And when she finally passed the bar, it wasn't with celebration. It was with quiet resolve. She wasn't chasing comfort, she was chasing accountability. Her first cases were small, local, almost invisible. A grandmother evicted for a landlord's greed. A teenager wrongly accused because his hoodie looked suspicious. A single mother charged for defending herself. Each case carried a story bigger than the paperwork. She began to see a pattern. The same system that promised fairness was built with cracks that swallowed certain people whole. But Crockett never pitied her clients. She empowered them. She listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, juries leaned in. Truth doesn't yell, she once told a reporter years later. It just waits for people to be quiet enough to hear it. Still, the world didn't make it easy. She faced moments that tested more than her intellect. There was the day a courthouse guard stopped her in the hallway, assuming she was part of the cleaning staff. There was the time a judge asked if she was filling in for the real attorney. Every slight, every raised eyebrow, every underestimation became another layer of armor. In those years, she learned that respect wasn't granted by titles or institutions. It was something you built brick by brick, case by case, truth by truth. Her mentor, an aging civil rights attorney who'd marched in the 60s, once told her, "In every courtroom, respect isn't demanded, it's earned." The words stuck like scripture. When she won her first major defense case, she didn't celebrate publicly. She simply walked out of the courthouse, stood on the steps, and let the afternoon sun hit her face. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. A child she defended ran up and hugged her legs. "You talk different," he said. She smiled. "That's because I mean every word." Years passed, and with each victory, her reputation grew. Not as the loudest voice, but as the one that never flinched. Her courtroom presence was calm, almost unnerving to her opponents. She spoke slowly, deliberately, forcing her words to land like verdicts. When politics came calling, she didn't go looking for it. It found her. Constituents saw in her not just a lawyer, but a fighter who made justice human again. She ran for Congress not because she wanted a title, but because she wanted to carry her clients' stories from the courthouse steps to the Capitol floor. Her campaign slogan was simple: the law should serve people, not power. Washington, of course, was another kind of courtroom, one where truth was negotiable and image was currency. The halls were lined with smiles that didn't reach the eyes. In committees, she saw lawmakers rehearsing outrage for the cameras, crafting viral moments instead of honest dialogue. It frustrated her, but it also clarified her purpose. If others treated democracy as theater, she would treat it as testimony. She never lost her habit of preparation. Even in Congress, her nights looked the same: legal pads covered in notes, coffee gone cold, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing from her law school days. Behind every sharp question she asked on record was a lifetime of quiet study. She never improvised when the truth was on the line, but she also carried the weight of representation. Every time she spoke, she knew there were young women watching who'd been told to soften their edges, to apologize for their intelligence. She refused to play small. She wasn't there to be tolerated, she was there to be reckoned with. Still, beneath the discipline, there was heart. She volunteered quietly on weekends, visiting shelters and legal aid centers, helping those who couldn't afford voices like hers. No cameras, no press releases, just service. That was her grounding force amid the chaos of Washington's vanity. And yet, no matter how disciplined she became, no amount of preparation could fully shield her from the sneers, the dismissive tones, the coded condescension that followed her every success. It wasn't hatred. It was fear, disguised as civility. The night before the Supreme Court hearing, she reread the case file alone in her office, her mentor's quote pinned above her desk. The city outside was restless, full of noise. But inside that quiet space, she found calm. She knew what awaited her: the cameras, the scrutiny, the smirks. She also knew she'd faced worse, with nothing but truth in her hands, and that had always been enough. As she closed her folder and looked up at the Capitol dome glowing through her window, She smiled faintly. Fate has a strange sense of timing, she thought. And that's when fate placed her opposite the most dismissive voice in the chamber. The marble chambers of the Supreme Court were so silent you could hear the shuffle of paper. Every journalist in the gallery had their pens poised, lenses focused. The air itself seemed to brace for impact. Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, not rigid, not defensive, simply present. Her posture was relaxed, her breathing steady. She had spent her life mastering that calm. Before her sat the nation's highest justices, their black robes forming a wall of authority. To her right, the opposition waited, confident, almost smug. His name had trended all week, his tone dripping with the practiced certainty of someone who believed he owned the room. Crockett adjusted her microphone. "Your Honors," she began, her voice smooth, low, and deliberate. "This isn't about political convenience or partisan loyalty. It's about the letter of the law and the spirit that gives it life." The first words landed like pebbles in still water, rippling quietly, undeniably. Her opponent leaned forward, fingers tapping impatiently. "Counselor," he interrupted, forcing a smirk, "perhaps you could spare us the philosophy and stick to the facts." The audience chuckled softly. Crockett didn't flinch. She simply turned her gaze toward him, eyes steady, the kind of look that stripped away pretense. "Respectfully, Counselor," she replied, "facts without principles are just statistics." A murmur rippled through the room. The Chief Justice's brow lifted slightly. The questioning began, calm, methodical, surgical. Each inquiry sliced through rhetoric with precision. She referenced precedents without notes, quoted rulings from memory, built logic like scaffolding. Her tone never rose, it didn't need to. Authority wasn't something she performed, it emanated from her. Her opponent, however, was unraveling. Each attempt to interrupt grew more desperate.
"Let me correct. You want? That's irrelevant."
"With all due respect, Miss Crockett." But she moved through his interjections like wind around stone, unmoved, unbroken. Each time he cut her off, she waited, just waited. And when silence returned, she resumed exactly where she'd left off. "May I continue, Your Honors?" she asked once, voice steady as glass. "Please do," Chief Justice Roberts said, his tone carrying the faintest edge of approval. She continued, drawing the courtroom deeper into her rhythm. Facts flowed into arguments, arguments into meaning. It wasn't theatrics, it was control. Even the gallery seemed to breathe in time with her cadence. Every pause was deliberate, every emphasis a soft strike of conviction. Her opponent's voice, in contrast, began to crack under the weight of his own interruptions. He fumbled with his papers, citing a precedent that didn't fit. Crockett's eyebrow arched just slightly. She waited for him to finish, then dismantled his claim with a single sentence and a reference so precise it made two clerks glance up in disbelief. Tension thickened. The senators watching from the side row exchanged uneasy looks. The cameras caught every flicker of emotion, his irritation, her poise. The gallery whispered now, not loudly enough to interrupt, but just enough for the sound to hum beneath the silence. Even the marbles seemed to echo her words differently, sharper, cleaner. Her voice carried a quiet gravity. "When the law is used to shield the powerful instead of protect the people," she said, "it ceases to be justice, it becomes theater." That line hit like a gavel. A few spectators gasped outright. Her opponent shifted, jaw tight, trying to regain footing. "That's quite the accusation," he sneered. "It's quite the reality," she replied. The Chief Justice leaned forward slightly, watching her with an expression that was half curiosity, half respect. He didn't intervene. He didn't need to. The balance of power had already shifted. Crockett pressed on, piece by piece, exposing contradictions, cutting through double talk. Her words built momentum not through volume, but through clarity. The truth was her tempo, and everyone else had to adjust to it. By now, her opponent's confidence had dissolved into visible frustration. His interruptions turned into mistakes, his tone defensive. Every attempt to undermine her only framed her composure in sharper relief. Finally, after another failed objection, he threw up his hands slightly. "So you're suggesting, Counselor, that you understand the Constitution better than decades of interpretation?" She paused. The room froze. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to feel it. Then she leaned slightly toward the microphone, her eyes unwavering. "No," she said softly. "I'm suggesting we finally start reading it as it was meant to be understood." The chamber went utterly still. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. And then, one sentence changed everything. The moment stretched into eternity. The chamber, vast and echoing, felt suspended between heartbeats. Jasmine Crockett stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the podium, her gaze locked on the man who had spent weeks mocking her intellect in the media. His smirk had faded. Now he waited, uncertain, defensive. Crockett took a slow breath. The shuffle of papers behind her stilled. Even the clicking of pens from reporters ceased, as though every sound recognized its own irrelevance. Then, with deliberate calm, she spoke. "Counselor," She began softly. You've quoted the Constitution as if it's your property. But the words you cling to, equal protection under the law, don't bend to ego. They demand accountability. A faint ripple moved through the gallery. Cameras clicked once, then stopped, almost reverently. She stepped closer to the bench, her voice deepening. Not louder, but heavier, anchored by purpose. For months, this chamber has been flooded with half-truths and sound bites. You say you defend the law. But what you've really defended, she said, pausing to let the silence swell, is power. The words hit with surgical precision. Her opponent shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie. Somewhere in the back row, a spectator inhaled sharply. Crockett continued, her tone still measured. You argue precedent as if it absolves injustice. You cite rulings from centuries ago, written by men who never imagined a courtroom where a woman like me could stand here and speak. And yet, here I am. The impact was immediate. Heads turned. Even Justice Roberts' expression softened, the faintest flicker of reflection crossing his face. Crockett let that silence linger, then pressed on. The law evolves. Or it dies. Precedent is not scripture. It's a record of who we were, not a command to stay there. You want to hide behind tradition. Fine. But tradition has been used to justify segregation, to silence truth-tellers, to punish the innocent and protect the powerful. Tell me, how long do we excuse history before we start making it right? Her opponent opened his mouth to object. The Chief Justice lifted a single finger, an unspoken command. Continue. Crockett's gaze shifted toward the justices. Every case that has changed the trajectory of this nation began with one person daring to say, this interpretation no longer serves justice. That's not rebellion. It's patriotism. It's belief in the promise that America can correct itself. A pen rolled off a table and clattered onto the marble floor. No one moved to pick it up. Crockett's voice rose, not in volume but in conviction. When you dismiss arguments like mine as emotional, you expose your fear, not of chaos but of clarity. Because clarity forces a reckoning, and reckoning is how justice breathes. Her opponent's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. She turned toward him fully now. You talk about order. But order without fairness is tyranny dressed in a robe. You call it upholding the law. I call it hiding behind it. The line landed like thunder. A gasp broke from the gallery, echoing faintly beneath the high ceiling. The Chief Justice's eyes narrowed, studying, absorbing, impressed. Crockett continued, relentless but poised. The Constitution was not written to preserve comfort. It was written to challenge it. It's not a fortress. It's a mirror. And today that mirror reflects the cracks we've chosen to ignore. She took a single step back from the podium, letting her words linger. I stand here not as a partisan, not as a headline, but as a citizen who believes that law without empathy is just paperwork, and justice without courage is just theater. Silence. Then the faint hum of the air conditioning returned, as if the world itself was exhaling. Crockett lowered her tone again. This nation has survived every test because somewhere, in every generation, someone refuses to bow to arrogance disguised as authority. I may not have your years of tenure, counselor, but I have something far older than any ruling. She looked him straight in the eye. Integrity. The word echoed. The man blinked, his mouth parting slightly, searching for a retort that never came. She turned her attention back to the bench. Your honors, the argument before us isn't about precedent, it's about principle. And principle isn't defined by the loudest voice in the room. It's defined by the one that still speaks when everyone else falls silent. And then she stopped. No dramatic gesture, no flourish, just stillness. The pause stretched so long that even the marble walls seemed to listen. Justice Roberts leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once on the wood before him. His eyes, thoughtful and sharp, met hers, and for a brief, electric moment something passed between them, recognition, respect. Then, quietly but unmistakably, he nodded. The sound came next, a single clap. Roberts' hand struck the desk once, then again, and again. It took a second for the room to register it. The Chief Justice of the United States was applauding. The gallery gasped. A few stood instinctively. A low murmur swelled. Reporters glancing at one another, disbelief rippling like heat through the chamber. Then the applause spread. First a few, then many, restrained but unmistakable. Her opponent sat frozen, his expression somewhere between shock and disbelief. Cameras captured the scene, the marble grandeur, the spectators, the Chief Justice still clapping slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging not victory but truth. Crockett didn't smile. She simply nodded once, eyes glistening but steady. Her face carried the calm of someone who hadn't come to win applause, but to speak clarity into a room long clouded by performance. As the echoes of the applause faded, Robert spoke, his voice measured. Counselor Crockett, he said, this court appreciates not only your argument but your composure. That single line carried more weight than any verdict. For a moment, the entire chamber stood united, not as partisans, not as adversaries, but as witnesses to something rare. Integrity met with respect. The cameras flashed again, capturing the stillness that followed, the historic silence after the storm. Reporters whispered phrases like unprecedented, reverent, transformative. Even the critics, watching from afar, paused before typing their next opinion. Crockett gathered her notes slowly, her fingers trembling just slightly now, not from fear, but from the magnitude of the moment. Behind her, someone whispered, "She did it." And in that hushed reverence, the truth was undeniable. She hadn't just argued the law, she had reminded the nation why it exists. The applause faded into a quiet that felt almost sacred. The marble walls seemed to hold the memory of it, as though the building itself had witnessed a shift in history's rhythm. Crockett turned toward the exit, her heels clicking softly against the floor. As she reached the door, she glanced back, just once. Justice Roberts was still watching her, the faintest smile on his face. Outside, the air was cool, the sky sharp blue against the steps of the courthouse. Reporters surged forward, microphones flashing, voices overlapping, but she said nothing. Her silence was louder than any sound bite, because everyone inside already knew the answer to the question that had started it all. What did she do to earn that reaction? She spoke truth, calmly, fearlessly, and without compromise. But the silence that followed wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The clip hit the internet before Jasmine Crockett even left the courthouse steps. One camera angle, Justice Roberts' slow, deliberate applause, spread like wildfire across every platform. Within minutes, the hashtags began climbing: Pay Crockett moment, fire respecting court, fade justice speaks. By nightfall, the story wasn't just trending, it was defining the day. Twitter, what was now X, became a digital battleground of admiration and disbelief. One post read, "I've covered DC politics for 20 years. Never seen Roberts applaud from the bench. Jasmine Crockett just made history." Another, from a law student in Chicago, went viral. "We watched a woman walk into a chamber built to intimidate her, and walk out having changed it." On TikTok, reaction edits flooded timelines. Slow motion clips of her mic drop line, "Law without empathy is just paperwork," were remixed with cinematic music, captions flashing. "As she said, he'd be she bien ki. A side-by-side meme showed her opponent's stunned face paired with the caption, "When you realize the rookie came prepared." Millions liked, commented, shared. Cable networks scrambled to rewrite their evening rundowns. CN led with a banner, "Chief Justice applauds young attorney? A historic moment for civility?" SMBC called it a masterclass in composure. Even Fox News, though hesitant, opened with the headline, "Unexpected applause raises eyebrows in Supreme Court." The story wasn't just news, it was narrative. Clips of Crockett's argument looped on every morning show. The View replayed her calm stare, each host weighing in. "That's what Grace under fire looks like," said one. "She didn't just win the moment," said another. "She restored what courtroom respect is supposed to feel like." Late-night hosts couldn't resist. On The Daily Show, the monologue began with a freeze frame of Roberts mid-clap. "When the Chief Justice starts slow clapping in court, that's not just respect," the host joked. "That's America saying, 'Finally, someone read the Constitution without bias!'" The audience roared. Even beyond the laughter, the tone had shifted. Commentators from across the spectrum, left, right, center, acknowledged that something had changed. A conservative columnist wrote, "I disagree with her politics. But Crockett's conduct was exemplary. She didn't grandstand, she reasoned, and that, we must admit, is rare." A retired judge posted, "That moment wasn't political, it was human. It was law returning to what it should be, the pursuit of fairness, not dominance." By the next morning, Crockett's face appeared on the covers of TM, Politico, and The Atlantic. The headlines were variations of one theme, the woman who made the court listen. Meanwhile, on social media, a movement of young lawyers and students found their new symbol. Hashtags evolved into slogans. "Argue like Crockett," "Facts and Grace," "Respect is power." University law programs began referencing the moment in lectures. Professors replayed the footage to demonstrate non-confrontational dominance, the art of persuasion without aggression. One tweet from Harvard Law's official account read, "Future attorneys, take note. This is how composure dismantles arrogance." Even international outlets picked up the story. The Guardian called it a cinematic collision between humility and hubris. Le Monde ran the headline, "An American courtroom rediscovers its humanity." Celebrities joined the chorus. Viola Davis tweeted, "That's how you turn tension into triumph. Grace, intelligence, fire." Mark Ruffalo reposted the clip with the caption, "Integrity has entered the chat." Within hours, it had 5 million likes. For once, the internet wasn't divided. It was inspired. Inspiration quickly became introspection. Talk shows and podcasts turned the conversation toward the deeper theme, civility. When did we stop rewarding calm? One host asked. When did reason become weakness? Another answered. Maybe it took someone like her to remind us that intellect can be powerful without being cruel. Clips from school debate clubs showed students imitating Crockett's composure. Teachers played her speech to discuss rhetoric and dignity. A viral classroom video showed a teen quoting her line, "Justice without courage is just theater." As his classmates erupted in applause, across dinner tables, comment sections, and studio panels, the tone was shifting. Not everyone agreed with her politics, but nearly everyone agreed on her poise. She became a symbol not of partisanship, but of principle. Some of her critics tried to downplay the moment. It was performance, they said. But even they struggled to ignore the ripple effect. The calmness that had once been mocked as soft now read as unshakable. The intellect once dismissed as idealistic now looked like the future. And somewhere in those reverent pauses between debates and news cycles, Americans recognized something rare, a flash of respect in an era of noise. Back in her hometown, a mural began to appear on a brick wall, her profile eyes lifted, courtroom lights painted behind her. The words beneath read, "Respect is earned, not demanded." By week's end, the video had reached over 100 million views. Students recited her quotes in mock trials. Hashtags turned into T-shirts. Even her opponent, when asked by a reporter about the incident, gave a strained smile and said quietly, she handled that with grace. The story was no longer just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about what her moment revealed, a hunger for clarity, civility, and courage. And as the nation continued to talk, tweet, and replay that moment again and again, one truth stood above the noise: respect. Once forgotten had become viral. Yet beyond the applause, something deeper was taking shape. Morning light spilled across the courthouse steps the next day, soft and golden, as if the world itself had exhaled overnight. The frenzy had quieted, but something deeper lingered in the air, an unspoken awareness that the country had witnessed more than a courtroom exchange. It had witnessed a shift in tone, a reminder of what justice was meant to sound like. Jasmine Crockett sat by a window overlooking the Capitol, her reflection framed by the city she had once only dreamed of walking through as a student. Reporters still waited outside, eager for a quote, a headline, a moment to extend the story. But she wasn't thinking about cameras or applause. She was thinking about something her mentor had told her years ago. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned, and once it's earned, it can change the room. The room had changed. For a generation that had grown tired of shouting matches and political theater, calm defiance had struck a different chord. It wasn't the loudness of her voice that made people listen. It was the steadiness of her conviction. In a time when noise often passed for strength, she had proved that dignity still carried power. Commentators tried to define it. Some called it a return to civility. Others said it was the rebirth of intellectual courage. But to the millions watching, it felt simpler than that. It felt like truth finally spoken without fear. In classrooms, in newsrooms, in quiet homes across America, people were replaying that moment of silence after her final words. That silence had become its own language, a pause that said, "This is what integrity looks like." Crockett understood that applause fades, hashtags fade, but the echo of respect, that endures. Because respect isn't viral by accident, it spreads when people recognize something genuine in another person's courage. She hadn't come to win. She'd come to remind the nation that justice doesn't belong to those who shout the loudest. It belongs to those who stand firm when it matters most. And in that chamber, beneath the marble and the weight of centuries, she had done just that. Truth had stood taller than power. That's what the headlines missed, what the sound bites couldn't capture. It wasn't about her victory over a rival. It was about the quiet triumph of principle over ego and grace over arrogance. She hadn't humiliated anyone. She'd elevated everyone who still believed in fairness. Outside, a group of students held handmade signs. Law with empathy. Speak like Crockett. Truth tore power. They weren't cheering. They were standing silent, united. A living echo of the moment she had created. And that, she realized, was the real victory. For once, the nation's conversation wasn't about scandal or sides. It was about standards. About how people could disagree without demeaning, argue without hatred, and defend justice without losing humanity. Crockett smiled faintly, watching the students below. She thought of the courtroom again, the stunned silence, the Chief Justice's nod, the applause that followed. She didn't need to relive it. She just needed to remember what it proved, that the law, when spoken with sincerity, still had the power to humble even the proudest rooms. She gathered her notes, slipped them into her bag, and whispered to herself, "This is what America still can be." As she stepped into the sunlight, cameras flashed again, but this time the moment felt different. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about possibility, because somewhere deep in the collective heart of the country, A simple truth had taken root. Dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to stand its ground. And on that day, in that courtroom, dignity had stood taller than arrogance, calm had conquered chaos, and justice, real human justice, had reminded America of its promise. The applause was over, but the echo had just begun. And that, right there, was the moment that silenced a courtroom and moved a nation. The headline said it best: Justice Roberts applauds Jasmine Crockett's legal brilliance. Courtroom fell silent in respect. But behind that headline lived something bigger than a single day or a single victory. It was a reminder that intellect still matters, that composure still cuts through chaos, that truth, when spoken with courage, still has the power to command a room. From the opening tension to the standing applause, this story wasn't just about one woman. It was about what she represents. Every voice told it was too young, too bold, too different to be taken seriously, until that voice spoke with undeniable clarity. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend a case. She defended the idea that respect is the ultimate authority. And she did it without shouting, without spectacle, just grace, discipline, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing who you are and why you're there. So, as this story echoes beyond the marble halls and into living rooms, classrooms, and conversations across the country, let it remind you dignity is strength and calm is power. If this story inspired you, if you believe intellect and integrity still deserve a spotlight, then don't just scroll past it. Subscribe, share. Be part of the movement that refuses to let cynicism win, because every time we amplify truth told with courage, we keep that courtroom silence alive, the silence that follows when arrogance finally meets accountability. This isn't the end of Jasmine Crockett's story, and it's not the end of ours, because somewhere out there, the next voice of reason is getting ready to stand up, take a breath, and speak truth to power. Stay tuned, stay inspired.